Hello and welcome to the Innovate to Zero webinar. Today we're going to be looking at ways in which we can reduce carbon and costs in the design and development of medical devices by leveraging sustainability as an opportunity. I'll be your host, Rich Shaw, the Sustainability Lead at PDM. PDM is a design and innovation consultancy based in the north of England. We have a particular focus in the health tech sector, where we've been working for 20 years. Our clients range from startups to PLCs, so covering a broad spectrum of companies. For the past 18 months, we've had a very high focus on sustainability within the sector. And under the guise of Innovate to Zero, we've been helping clients reduce carbon and cost through design and innovation. We're very connected in this sector. We work with networks such as BioNow, MediLink. We're very active in the ABHI Sustainability Working Group. Within the NIHR, we're putting together some NetZero Catalyst, which is a primer, if you like, for early stage companies to help them embed sustainability into their innovations. With the Department of Health and Social Care, we've been consulting on the Design for Life roadmap, which has been a pivotal piece of work in the last 12 months, focused on circularity within medical devices. And with BSI, I sit on one of the standards committee working towards a standard for remanufacturing medical devices here in the UK. Earlier this year, we were very fortunate to receive an award from BioNow for our services in sustainability. So sustainability in the health tech sector, there is a very immediate need brought about by the emissions created through the sector. So healthcare on a global level is responsible for 4 to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. To put that in context, that's more than aviation, that's more than sea freight. It's almost as much as adding those two together. If healthcare were a country, it would be the 5th largest polluter in the world, in between Russia and Japan in the top 10. So very, very impactful. And part of that is over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a huge shift towards single-use medical devices. This has caused an awful lot of clinical waste, much of which goes for incineration. Here, the NHS have framed the amount of emissions that they are reporting on. This is an updated plan, the previous one being released 5 years ago. And in this recent set of data, they've highlighted that 35% of their total emissions comes from medicines and medical equipment. So for those working in health technologies, we've got a huge part to play in helping decarbonize healthcare. Sustainability has hit the sector in different ways. Large multinational corporations were already on the journey. They were typically carbon accounting. They had ESG teams who were already looking and working on this anyway. For the SMEs, who in medtech make up the vast majority of suppliers to the likes of the NHS, this wasn't necessarily something they were already working on. And so over the last few years, there's been a lot of literacy building. And then moving beyond that, this new process of starting to account for emissions as well. It can be quite overwhelming. There's a lot to consider, new terminologies, etc. And although there's lots of support on what you could be looking at, actually translating that into practical terms for a company, in how do we go about doing it, that's the part where we've been stepping in and helping. So there's been an awful lot of progress in the sector over the last 5 years, lots of industry activities, reports being published, new bodies being set up, and collaborations between industry, academia, and even government as well. Some of the more pivotal ones are shown here, in particular the bottom left being the NHS's NetZero roadmap. They were the first healthcare system in the world to set a net zero target of 2040 for their own emissions. And that's filtered through into suppliers who are required to be net zero by 2045. Some of the other pivotal pieces more recently, the Design for Life roadmap. This was a piece of work put together by the Department of Health and Social Care, very much born out of the need for resilience within supply chains. So during COVID, when supply chains collapsed, there was the potential for shortage. It became very paramount that our supply chains were vulnerable. And so this activity was to look at how might we bring circularity in, keep devices in use for longer, and ultimately insulate ourselves against those global shocks. So I touched on the net zero milestones implemented by the NHS a few years ago now. So kicking off in 2022, they brought in social value. So this was a 10% weighting at procurement. So it could really influence your ability to win tenders and win contracts with the NHS. Since then, this has moved on into carbon reduction plans, which is using the greenhouse gas protocol, which is an international standard for how you measure emissions. And the requirement began with the very large contracts, and over time that's filtered down to cover virtually all contracts. There's lots of different emissions categories within the greenhouse gas protocol. To begin with, the NHS focused on scope 1 and 2, and then just a selection of those within scope 3. When we look ahead to 2027, this steps up a little bit. So all emissions within scope 3, of which there are 15 categories, they will all be required to be reported on. And also, we're looking at global emissions at that point, not just those emissions created in the UK. After that, 2028, there becomes more of a product level focus. So you may have heard the term the carbon footprint. This is where product level carbon footprinting starts to come in. Details on this are still to be released, but it's certainly one to watch out for. Whilst this is happening in the UK, it's by no means something that's exclusively happening here. At the moment, current estimates are in the region of 80 healthcare markets worldwide have adopted something very similar to this framework from the NHS. I mentioned earlier on about different reports and studies that were being released focusing on sustainability. And last year saw the Green Surgery report published from the Royal College of Surgeons. And in their recommendations to industry, you can see here in the highlighted sections that design features very prominently. And we're going to come back to this. It's because design is pivotal in reducing emissions. So it's a complex landscape and it can be difficult to know where to start. So to try and break this up into some digestible phases, we work through the approach of plan, innovate, and then design to zero. So in the planning phase, this is where, kind of reflecting the NHS milestones at the moment, it's all about understanding your emissions at a corporate level. So businesses are starting to do their carbon accounting, starting to embed processes to collect emissions year on year, and then put together a reduction plan each year, publishing their emissions. This makes them compliant for tenders so that they can bid for NHS contracts. If a company is kind of pre-revenue and they're still in an earlier stage, we can look to support them with things like a net zero scale-up guide. This can help give them foresight over the kind of emissions they're likely to be producing and helps them in response to things like funding calls, where they need to show how their business, their innovation, how it will align to a net zero healthcare system. So that's a separate piece of work. But with the planning in place, we can then move them forward. Here we see a breakdown of the greenhouse gas emissions protocol. So this is how emissions are categorized. In the center, we see the direct emissions, those being scope 1. This is for facilities operations that you have direct control over. So if you have a fleet of company vehicles, There is an exhaust pipe, if you like, that is releasing emissions. If you have an office, it's perhaps heated with a gas boiler. That gas boiler has an exhaust flue, and again, it's releasing gases. So you are directly releasing those emissions from your premises. Scope 2 is indirect emissions, but purchased. And commonly here, you'll have electricity. So most organizations, unless they have solar panels, they're purchasing their energy from the national grid. And there is emissions being produced within the grids to create that energy and provide it to you. So this scope 2 accounts for those emissions. Scope 3 covers essentially everything else, and this fits into the supply chain. So things upstream of you and things downstream of you. Some of the particular ones to look out for here, and which the NHS has been focusing on to begin with, things like transportation, so the goods that you're purchasing and transporting, waste that you might be producing in your operations, in your production facilities as you're making things. Business travel and employee commuting, almost unavoidable, but very common to most companies. And then when we look at downstream transportation, it's a little bit of a misunderstanding here. This isn't necessarily goods leaving your facilities, but rather goods which are paid for by your customers, or the transportation of goods paid for by your customers. So from a financial context, it's downstream from you, rather than operationally being downstream. The big one to watch out for here is purchase goods and services. Any company that is manufacturing products, this is most likely to be their largest emissions category. A good way to think of scope 1, 2, and 3, or as a reminder, is burnt, bought, and beyond. So I'll just share with you some insights from companies we've worked with who've done their carbon reduction plans. Meeting the current NHS requirements of just those 5 categories in scope 3, which I'd circled in blue on the last slide, we usually see an emissions breakdown like this, with scope 1 and 2 accounting for roughly a quarter of emissions and scope 3 making up the rest. When we factor in all of scope 3, we usually find it's anywhere from 95 to 99% of emissions coming from scope 3. So whereas electric systems within the business, LED light bulbs, switching to electric vehicles, the kind of activities that a lot of companies have been undertaking in the last few years, is mainly going to improve scope 1 and 2. As we can see, scope 1 and 2 have a very minor impact into the overall operational emissions of a company. So it's really in the scope 3 where the long-term focus is needed. And how we see this typically break down, as I mentioned previously, purchase goods and services, typically around 70%. And this is essentially the products that you're producing. So think of the majority of emissions coming from products. Beyond that, things like transportation can be quite significant, especially in healthcare. There's lots of air freight used in healthcare, goods shipped from around the world, long supply chains, lots of suppliers in that chain, lots of transportation causing emissions along the way. Refrigeration can increase those emissions quite a lot as well, particularly for medicines or diagnostics, where there's reagents, etc. involved. These can often require a cold chain, that is refrigerated transportation, which again is increasing those emissions. Beyond that, we see typical activities. Most businesses will have things like employee travel, commuting, and then into the kind of smaller category at the end there, we see waste in operations. Typically, medtech companies are very efficient in how they produce things, so there's not an awful lot of waste. And category 12 being end-of-life treatment. As we know, a lot of medical devices end up going for incineration, and the emissions created there get categorized here. So that's really something which I think will get increasing focus on as we move forward and healthcare providers start to provide more data on this. When you've been through a carbon accounting activity, when you've created a carbon reduction plan, you'll come to realize that cost and carbon are directly related. For every invoice that you pay, there's a carbon cost associated to it. So if you can bring down the spend, you can typically bring down the carbon at the same time. And this is a very important lens to shine on sustainability. Companies are in business to make a profit. If they didn't, they wouldn't be in business anymore. So to be sustainable, a company also needs to be profitable. And so it's very important to look at it through this financial lens, not just a good for the environment lens. When we move on now to look at the Innovate to Zero phase, this is where we start to engage multi-stakeholders into an innovation process. We've already established that around 70% of emissions come from products. In this collaborative phase, we get the stakeholders together from multiple parts of an organization, may even be key suppliers. And the idea is to get everybody in one room and to start exploring different ideas, different opportunities, and the way we could reduce carbon and cost. It's usually a good place to start by trying to identify risks and challenges faced by an organization. From there, we can discuss opportunities. How might we address some of those risks and challenges? Putting a "how might we" statement in front of it is often a good way to talk to those points. The ultimate goal here is what's called the triple bottom line. Better for patients, planet, and for profits. By aiming at all of those 3 points, we know that we're onto something successful. Once we've been through the opportunities, we can then put them into a prioritization phase. And here we look at different criteria, such as what are the challenges in achieving that opportunity, things like regulatory risk, do we have the right personnel to achieve it, what kind of timeline is that likely to take. This can help to prioritize those opportunity statements. And from there, we're able to layer these up and formulate a product strategy. And this can get tied into the wider business strategy and help with the emissions reduction planning. When we get into the innovation phase, we can often talk to the different levers that can be pulled, different ways in which we might look to reduce the emissions and costs of product. Typically, these fall into 2 different areas. There's classic design and innovation activities, but also those within the supply chain. And there may be other parties in the business who have a focus on this already. Within design and development, we see things like clinical insight being very important and a very early step. So making sure we understand, how is that device being used today? Is that changing at all? How is the patient interacting with it? Making sure that it's really well optimized and that there aren't any unnecessary features in there. Beyond that, it's very important to consider the care pathway and the carbon costs within that. And what we're talking about here is for instance, every time a patient visits a hospital or their local doctor's surgery, there's travel, there's emissions created. For every diagnostic test that's run, there's emissions created. Every surgical procedure, there's emissions, etc. So throughout that care pathway, emissions are being created. If there's an opportunity to reduce the amount of patient travel, such as care through the community, remote monitoring, and virtual wards, this is a way of keeping people out of these care settings, such as hospitals, and in the home, and that will reduce the emissions through travel. Sustainable materials is one that we see come up a lot, and there's lots of activity happening in particularly the plastic sector with low carbon, bio-based materials, etc. This can be a real challenge, though, within medical devices because they're loaded with regulations that are there to protect the patient's safety. Things like toxicology, traceability within the supply chain. You really have to have great visibility over what's gone into and is happening upstream within your products, the materials that you're purchasing. So that can pose a bit of a challenge for some of the sustainable materials we see on the market, but there are some out there which are what's known as a swap-in, which can replace existing fossil fuel-based plastics, for instance. If changing the material is deemed to be too difficult and it's going to be much more practical to keep the current material in play, you could look to use less of it by doing a lightweighting exercise. And this may tie back to the clinical insight piece. So for instance, a length of suction tubing used in a surgical procedure typically come in a 3-meter length. Well, were they created in a 3-meter length because that was the distance needed in the beginning? Is that because the pump used to be on the side of the room and now it's located under the bed? Could that be shortened? Could we change the wall thickness and reduce weight that way? This can end up saving a significant amount of emissions and cost out of a product, so well worth considering. Modularity is another one. If there's a suite of products which could share internals, this can really help things like circularity, where you might want to aid, repair, remanufacture. By doing this, you can also reduce the stock holding of spare parts that you may need to carry. So well worth considering if that's appropriate for the product. Packaging is a very common place that companies have been starting out. It isn't without regulatory impacts. Packaging does form part of a product approval, but there's less regulation there to be contending with. So packaging can be a good place to start. There are things that you can do, looking at the amount of packaging, the size of that packaging, things like the information leaflets, which go into most bits of packaging. There's an increasing shift towards digitizing those, so you don't need to include what could be a 40, 50 gram, 30 different languages, information for use leaflet, which is then thrown in the bin virtually every time. If we can digitize those, that's one less thing we've put into the product. We've saved some carbon and we've saved some cost. Over on the supply chain side, looking at things like space optimization. So this can tie into things like warehousing and transportation. Keeping the packed volumes down means we can be more efficient in the way we're shipping things and storing things. This also ties into ease of sterilization, making sure that the way products are packaged will maximize the chance of sterilization first time without any issues, perhaps even shortening the cycle time that they're in the sterilization chambers. Transportation, as I've mentioned before, is a big one within the sector. So wherever possible, trying to move away from air freight and use sea freight for those global supply chains where long distances of transportation are required. It may be switching to more advanced manufacturing techniques or bringing in a more automated production process. If we can increase the throughput in a production facility, we're able to save cost and carbon. Most medical devices are assembled within a clean room, and that clean room has an air handling unit operating within it to minimize the particle count of the pathogens that can be contained within the air. So this constant circulation and filtering of the air requires energy, an awful lot of energy, in fact. And so the shorter we can make the production time, the less emissions that will be created in the manufacturing phase. At the junction of these two aspects sits circularity. We need to design for circularity, but we need to work with suppliers both upstream of us and downstream of us, i.e. the customer, in order to facilitate this transition from a linear to circular economy. And I'll explain more of that in the next slide. So a good way to explain the circular economy is through a visualization called the value hill. Here we have a linear economy. On the left-hand side of this pyramid, we've got raw materials being extracted from the earth and turned into a useful feedstock, such as a plastic pellet. That plastic pellet is then injection molded or extruded to form a component. Those components are then assembled together until we've got our final item. At this point, it reaches its user and it has its maximum level of value. With a single-use device, and once it's used, it's got this immediate loss in value. It's essentially discarded straight away, and very little to no value is kept from it. Within a circular economy, we try and keep that product in use at its maximum level of value for as long as possible. That perceived value with the original user is always going to be greatest. If a product gets damaged or needs some repair, that can be facilitated and then the product returned back to that original user. So a good example of this might be a surgical device, a stainless steel instrument that may get blunt over time. It can go off to a specialist repair service, they can sharpen it, they can make repairs to it, they can regrind it, polish it, re-sterilize it, and then get it back to that user. When things get a little bit beyond that, there might be a more significant refurbishment required. That may then be sold as a refurbished product, not even necessarily to the original user. If a product gets a bit beyond that, we might just look to recover some of the components within it. Say, for example, a PCB, a printed circuit board, out of an electronic device may well have a long life still to be used if we can recover it. And if we can't do anything else with that product, at least recycle those materials so that it can be fed back into a new product. One of the key things to remember from this slide is that recycling is considered the last step, but there's lots of other measures we could take first to try and keep the value in that product. Now we're going to look at some of the barriers within circularity, and there's plenty of them. One of the primary ones is this need for a mindset shift, particularly for manufacturers who've been doing things for a certain way for a very long time. To see this as an opportunity and not just a barrier, a tick box, a burden, it can require this mindset shift. And this is where looking at it back through a lens of cost saving is carbon saving, we start to find the opportunity. To facilitate this, though, it's a systemic problem, so we need a systems thinking approach to change this. And in order to achieve that, we need to collaborate. It's those upstream of us, our supply chain. Perhaps we need to work with them to get product sent back, reground, and then shot into new product. And those downstream from us who've got the product at the end of life, where we need to recover it. So this is the need for collaboration, which can be quite difficult to get off the ground, principally because everybody needs to see a financial benefit to making that happen. And that can be quite difficult to flesh out, especially at an early stage. As I've mentioned before, this fragmented responsibility means there's this lack of ownership. And without entire ownership, we aren't going to have one person taking responsibility for that product. The procurement decisions that I referenced earlier with the NHS's supplier roadmap, it has historically been driving the unit cost of product rather than looking at a total life cycle impact. So if a product is actually causing a lot of waste or emissions in its end of life phase, that may not really be accounted for when you see that unit price, or that very low unit price for that product that's coming from the other side of the world with a very dirty production method that's not really getting captured if we're only focused on the lowest price point. So procurement teams have also got a bit of a new lens to put over their activities as well. As I mentioned, regulatory and compliance is a real challenge within the sector. There are an awful lot of regulations and they vary depending on a medical device, what it does, if it's implanted, where it's used, how it's used, etc. Regulations are geared up around patient safety, and that's always going to be the priority. But if there's a conflict whereby we're not able to utilize materials, then we're going to come into a bit of a sticking situation. So here we also need to see a fresh look at regulations to see where there is scope to help support or even encourage more circular, more sustainable options. There are behavioral norms. It's part of human nature. We slip into habits very easily. This happens at a clinical level, and this might be things like packaging, which perhaps is labeled as recyclable, isn't getting put into the right bin within like a hospital environment. Patients might be used to using their device in a certain way. Maybe they've had that same kind of device, month on month for their entire life. If it gets changed to a recyclable version, will they actually recycle it? They've also got a part to play. And of course, industry. This can be a massive shift for industry to make. And when there's pressures around shareholders and profits, it can be very difficult to make a long-term plan in this space. But to go back to the original point about corporate reduction of emissions, we can see what an important part product plays. And product in the medical device world is a long-term play. It could take 10 years to bring a product to market, and it could be in the market for 10 to 15 years. So if we've currently got 20 years to be net zero, that's not very many product life cycles to get this right and to bring a significant emission reduction through. So finally, we come to the design to zero phase. And this is where we look to leverage design as a method to design out these emissions. The reason this is important is that researchers highlighted 80% of a product's carbon footprint was determined at the design phase. So whilst that product is going through those initial phases, design and development, things like the materials, the way in which it's assembled, the manufacture process, the coatings, the treatments, all of these things embody carbon into that product and may dictate what can be done with it downstream, such as how is it handled by the user? Is it discarded immediately? Are they able to use it longer? Was it designed for long life? Was it robust? Was it designed to be recovered? Was it designed to be disassembled, etc.? So design has a really critical part to play. How we see this play out in action, if we were to work on a project, it comes through in several different phases. So we start off by taking either the existing product, a benchmark product, be that a competitor or something similar in the marketplace. We could also do this with a concept, even at an early stage. And here we look to build up a baseline picture, build some data around it, things that we can measure to give us some metrics to work from. You've probably heard of carbon footprint. We went through that a little bit earlier on. So here we could do something like a high-level product carbon footprint assessment, or look at it in terms of its circularity. What percentage of it is utilizing recycled materials, that kind of thing. Once we've got that baseline in place, we can look at the hotspots. So which are the components? What are the processes? What are the life cycle stages where most of those emissions are coming from? Once we understand where those hotspots are, we can then move into designing them out. So in this design development phase, we can get very focused on those hotspot areas and get the biggest bang for buck in terms of emission reduction. Once we've taken it through that phase, we can then repeat that same baseline activity, trying to keep as many of those variables the same and consistent as possible. And we can see what a percentage reduction we've been able to make. By going through this activity, iterating through it, you can get a very good understanding of where you can optimize your product for carbon and cost. So to bring this to life, let's look at a case study example. This was for a Class 1 medical device used in primary care. It's a baby weighing scale. So we started off with this baseline activity. We broke the product down into its individual components and looked at it in terms of its product carbon level footprint or a component level carbon footprint. We also looked at it in terms of circularity by using a circularity indexing tool. That gave us a great impression of the current status, how much of that product is already utilizing recycled material and how much of it is virgin. This helped us understand which life cycle stages were causing these impacts. From those hotspots, we're then able to identify what are those most impactful components. It might be those components made from a very high intensity material. Particularly metals can have a very high intensity. And then what was the cause of those impacts? Was it in the material itself? Was it because of a production process? Was it the transportation? Were they being shipped by air freight for a very long distance? Those kind of things can impact that score. With those identified, we then designed these out. So we addressed those emissions hotspots and we looked at it through different lenses. Principally the materials. This product was very heavy in terms of its carbon footprint in the material aspect. So we looked at possible material substitutions we could make and some of the production processes at the same time. There was an opportunity to look at circularity here. This product was a long life product. They would be serviced and repaired and calibrated to keep them accurate. That created an opportunity for servicing, repair, and refurbishment, keeping these products in use longer, or even opening a new market for refurbished product. We'd found through some clinical insight that there were some features within the product that were completely redundant. They'd now been made obsolete by how the care pathway had evolved. So those features we were able to remove, design them out. This allowed the manufacturer to save on the tooling cost, on assembly cost, production cost, etc., by removing these unnecessary features. When we repeated this baseline, we found we'd made a 25.6% reduction to the carbon footprint, but most impressively was a 19% reduction in landed cost. Through the materials work, we'd managed to reduce the virgin material usage by 75%. By onshoring some of the large moldings, we were able to reduce the overall package size by 50%, which meant we could use, for example, a 40-foot container instead of a 20-foot container when shipping product from the other side of the world. This 50% reduction is very significant, not to be underestimated. And as I mentioned, unlocking product as a service and stable revenue stream is very, very important, especially when we're living in a world with fluctuating markets, currency volatility, etc., where there's a stable revenue stream that really helps businesses plan and grow stably. I hope you found this webinar interesting. One of my takeaway messages is that those products designed today reduce the emissions of tomorrow. So just think about what is it we're creating right now and how might we optimize that? When you think about the lead time in bringing a medical device to market and suddenly only having 20 years to reach a net zero end date, it's not that far away. As I said, it could be just 2 product life cycles. So those products are going to need to deliver a significant carbon saving when they're contributing 70-ish% of a company's emissions. In other words, reaching net zero will require a sustainable product strategy. That's all from me. I look forward to seeing you soon.